Okay. Good morning. Sorry for all the technical complications. Um, well, welcome everybody. This is a new brown bag session from the NCME JSIC. Today we're going to have our friends from Harvard, Emma Klugman, Lily Ann, Zachary Himmelsbach. I'm sure if I pronounced your name correctly. Sophie Litzworth and Tara Nicola. They all together wrote a very interesting paper commenting on a paper that was published in EMIP about social responsibility in the testing industry, and in particular in the case of college admission. The paper had a lot of comments, and there was one paper in particular that was written by graduate students. So as JC, we were kind of interested to see more in detail like what you responded, and yeah, we wanted to invite you to kind of speak about in general about the paper and about your response and your comment. So yeah, thank you for accepting our invitation, and please, I mean, you can start and see more, I don't know, hear more about your process of how this response happened and your ideas too.
Great. Thank you so much, Sergio. I can kick us off and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have some folks tuning in today. There are some names that I recognize and many that I don't, so that's cool. And yeah, as we've just heard, there's a few different papers involved with this. So just to orient you, here's the slides just got posted in the chat. You're welcome to go check those out so you can see these links and follow them yourself. So there was an original paper written to elicit commentary in EMIP. Then we've written one of several responses. And following that, there is a response from the original authors to the body of the commentaries, of which I think there were about maybe 12 or 13 in total. It seemed to inspire a lot of conversation. And then also coming up in a couple months over at NCME, there'll be a session that I've organized with some of the other authors of different commentary papers, where we'll bring in a bunch of people to talk about what socially responsible college admissions might look like, and a few different people's visions on that and different takes on that. So that's roughly the kind of the moving parts involved with this. And then today we've got three of the five of us who wrote this. The fourth and fifth, Sophie and Zach, are gainfully employed, having gotten her PhD as Sophie, and unfortunately ill and unable to join us today as Zach. But the rest of us, as Sergio said, we're graduate students still interested in a number of different things. So you'll see on the right-hand side here that we've got some folks who are more classically kind of psychometrics and measurement interested, but we've also got a number of other different perspectives and disciplinary focuses that we bring that we really enjoyed bringing into discussion, and that also, I think, really shaped the way this paper came to be. So yeah, let's start by giving you a sense of what we wrote, and then we'll talk more about how this paper came to be and what the author's response looked like.
Thanks for kicking us off, Emma. So before we talk about what we wrote, we wanted to give you an overview of what the original paper was about. So the crux of the argument in the original manuscript was that college admission tests and other high-stakes standardized tests are increasingly seen as perpetuating societal inequities. And the authors argue that, quote, this is because the testing industry has turned a blind eye to the negative consequences of educational testing for far too long. And the authors here recognize that the tests themselves are not causing adverse impacts on students, but rather how the tests are used and interpreted. But they believe that the testing industry has not done enough to address the deleterious consequences of these exams on students, universities, and society. And as such, they argue that by not being part of the solution, testing agencies are part of the problem. And a big part of the article is this analogy, this discussion they have about social responsibility. They liken the denial of responsibility of the testing agencies for the negative testing consequences to the denial of the negative social consequences of the operation of business corporations in the 1990s. The poor working conditions of factory workers, environmental pollution caused by manufacturing, child labor, and many other issues gained widespread attention for big companies during that time. And these companies, as a result, began to embrace an idea of social responsibility that emphasizes transparency, accountability, listening to stakeholders, and just acting more ethically. The authors present a case study of one company in particular, Nike, as an example of a company that adapted to embrace this ethic of social responsibility. In the 1990s, the treatment of workers at the factories that Nike contracted with overseas, their poor working conditions, low wages, child labor, hit the front pages. And Nike argued that they couldn't be held responsible for the actions of these independent contractors they worked with because they did not have direct oversight over the factories. But there was a huge public backlash with the company losing major apparel and footwear contracts as a result. And the company was struggling by the late 1990s. At that time, its CEO announced a number of changes to improve its public image, including increasing the minimum wage and hiring workers whose job it was to focus solely on increasing the company's social responsibility, and also conducting independent inspections of the factories it worked with. The authors in this article argue that there are clear parallels between the backlash against Nike in the 1990s and the current backlash against the testing industry, and ask what questions the test companies today can learn from Nike. And they introduced a 5-stage model for thinking about corporate social responsibility adoption. The stages being defensive, when companies essentially say this is not our problem. The second is compliance, when they do the bare minimum. The third, managerial. Strategic is the fourth, when they begin to see the social responsibility as actually helping the company strategically. And then kind of the pinnacle at the top is when they take on this broader role of encouraging not just their own company, but others as well to follow suit. The authors in this article argue that testing companies are still in this first stage of adoption of this corporate social responsibility ethic with the "it's not our job" mentality for fixing the disparate impacts of tests. The authors then outline what testing agencies essentially would need to do to move up this pyramid. So like stage 2, they argue, would be if the testing agencies create corporate policies around ethical design and administration of tests. Stage 3 would be not only just establishing procedures to conduct IDF analyses, but investing in exploring ways of testing that reduce performance gaps. Stage 4 occurs when companies integrate educational improvements and gap reduction specifically in their business models, considering the voices of stakeholders who historically may not have been consulted in the development of tests. And stage 5, the final stage, would occur when the testing industry works with others in broader society, both within the education sphere like AERA and NCME, and outside, to promote business practices that promote social responsibility in testing in the US and abroad. At the end of the article, the authors outline a few steps that they think testing agencies can take to move towards embracing this ethic of social responsibility, including conducting more research to identify what skills students need to actually succeed in college, ensuring those skills are being tested in the assessments, and also identifying the extent to which students are actually given the opportunity to learn these skills in schools. And another being increasing transparency, creating channels for detecting and correcting any issues that arise with the assessments.
Thanks so much, Tara. So that's kind of where things got kicked off, is this original piece that was put out by EMIP, specifically like sent out to everyone, right? This email went out to whoever subscribed to the newsletter. Probably many of you will receive the same email as we did in late April last year, where they're soliciting commentaries. They say, here's a focal article. We think this is going to elicit some sort of conversation and possibly debate, they say. I'm blanking out the kind of boring bits so that you don't have to read the whole thing. But you see here in late April of last year, they send around an article, they say, you know, do folks want to write commentaries on this? Send them to us next month. And so one piece of advice that I think both Lily and I have received from our advisor, who I think received it from his philosophy professor back in the day, was perhaps in academia, you should read the literature, read until you get angry, and then go write. So in some sense of like, read until you find something that like there's a gap, or there's something that you disagree with, or you think they've missed something, and like that kind of thing. Once you've like read enough to identify what that is, can spur you to writing something that's something of a contribution. And so that's essentially what we did. And I'll try and be a little clear on what I mean by angry in this case, is that I think we, and probably the original authors, with whom I haven't had a chance to speak yet, and I look forward to meeting in San Diego in a couple months, I think very much agree on the like end goals here of like, I think everyone would love to see more equitable college admissions. We would love to see folks who have historically been marginalized and excluded gain access to college and the associating degrees and higher income careers at higher rates than we currently see. We would also love to see like that gap closure in test scores. If we, like, regardless of whether you think standardized tests like SAT or ACT accurately measure gaps that might exist between different groups, or whether they exacerbate those gaps, either way, I think everyone's in agreement that we would love to see those closed somehow. But I think when I read this article last year, I just wanted more. I wanted some more specificity on what exactly the testing companies should be doing. And so Tara said on the previous slide, a couple of the suggestions that these original authors had of what it would mean to be more transparent, what it would mean to take social responsibility, what it would mean for a testing company to consider itself responsible for closing those gaps, right? And I wanted to talk more about this and think more about this. So, and then if we head to the next slide, I read it and I sent around to a group email list. Is anyone interested in talking about this and seeing if we want to at least set up a meeting to talk about it, possibly end up writing something about it. So this is just an interested, like pretty informal lab group of people who took our like main psychometric methods course here and keep wanting to talk about those sorts of things. And then got various expressions of interest from different people. So Tara, for example, said she's really interested in college admissions and wants to hear more about like how we can talk more about this and what might we want to write about this. And so this was where we began to start shaping what our goals for the piece were. And like we're giving all of this information away because I think, as Sergio mentioned, like this is the only graduate student piece that ended up in the journal. And so how this came to be is perhaps of interest and is, I think, a fun story. But we started to kind of sketch out some of our goals for the piece. And we had a series of meetings about it, right? So at this point, we had 5 co-authors, or 5 people who were interested in talking. We set up a couple times to meet. And at this point, I had no idea whether we would be in any sort of agreement, whether we would have similar feelings or objections or like extensions that we wanted to add to the piece, or whether we'd be completely like disparate in how we thought about it. And so I didn't know what it would look like. And so I suggested in the 3rd point here in this email, let's chat, and whether or not we all have agreeing thoughts, we can probably gain a lot from discussing this and talking more about this in this like community of a few interested people. And perhaps we could come to some sort of middle ground. Perhaps we could find some interesting lessons from different disciplinary perspectives. Perhaps we could have different pros and cons clashing in one piece and see how that helped in our understanding. And honestly, I just wanted to spend time with these people talking about these things. And that was a huge plus of this process. And then, yeah, that's really how we turned this thing around in like roughly a month, is we had a few meetings. And then if we go to the next slide, we at some point started to shape what our goals were for this piece and what we wanted to write together. So first we wanted to dig into what seemed to be a really driving analogy in the original piece, this idea of corporate social responsibility as a possible solution, and as Nike as a close analog for testing companies. Several of our group felt that this argument, and especially because much of the original article was this argument by analogy, we didn't find it particularly convincing, and we thought that there were some key differences. Obviously, no analogy is going to be perfect, but I think we found it uncompelling, and we wanted to dig into why. We wanted to figure out what exactly it was that we thought was a mismatch between those scenarios, and why we thought this idea of corporate social responsibility, though lovely, isn't necessarily a panacea. One of our second goals, we wanted to bring in these different perspectives, right? So we have some folks in our group who are well-read and trained in things like the economics of education. We have Tara, who's especially interested in higher education and college admissions. And we wanted to see what it would look like to bring those perspectives together in this piece, and how that might frame our discussion. Third, and I think this is one of the biggest ones for me, is we wanted to be as specific as we could in coming up with some sort of solution or forward-looking positive something to try to contribute to the discussion. Some of the other commentaries were much more focused on either agreeing or disagreeing with the first paper. And we felt like just going through and saying what we thought was weird about the analogy wasn't the kind of paper we wanted to write, and wasn't the kind of paper people would necessarily want to read. We wanted to try and challenge ourselves to think, like, if we were to put some sort of a future-facing agenda in, what might that look like? And fourth, we wanted to acknowledge that we, most of us, I think, in our mid-20s and perhaps 30s, are graduate students. Most of us didn't have direct experience working at a testing company or even in college admissions office. So that was a piece we added in our final paragraph, was about just the perspective that we were bringing into this, especially considering that that this journal was asking to bring in different perspectives. We wanted to be clear about how our position as graduate students was shaping our take on this piece, and perhaps the various blind spots that we were aware that we might have, as everyone does. So yeah, that's the process of how we got to writing a piece together. And yeah, we'd love to share more about what we came up with and hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we're not sure if folks have had a chance to read our commentary yet, so we thought we would just summarize 3 main points that we were responding to in the focal paper. So the first one was that testing companies should be primarily responsible for these criticisms that we're all well aware of about college admissions testing. We raised the point in our commentary that this is perhaps a little short-sighted because testing companies have clients that might have more power in transforming the use of testing. It's not just a one-way street in college admissions, as we understand it, in college admissions testing. The second point was that, the author's main point, that adoption of corporate social responsibility, which we abbreviate as CSR, would be really beneficial. And like Emma said, and Tara brought up, the authors leaned on this Nike analogy. We actually took fault with the analogy, not because it wasn't perfect, but because there were actually substantive holes in the analogy that made us wonder if perhaps there is in fact no good corporate example of corporate social responsibility that could be transferred to our context. With the Nike analogy, as Tara explained, there were some immediate changes to the company's behaviors. We all agreed that was great. But long-term, we didn't see a lasting power. And as recently as 2020, Nike has been accused of using Uyghur slave labor in some of their factories. So we were kind of wondering, are there other examples of companies out there that have made lasting changes to their culture in a corporate, socially responsible way? I guess in order to think deeper about this, we probably need more basis in understanding what CSR is, and that was a little vague in the focal article as well. Lastly, this kind of relates to the first point too. The authors argued that testing companies should do more to make sure that tests are fair. And while we agree, we didn't see a specific proposal here. And we noted that things like the College Board's adversity score have not been well received. There was actually a really big backlash. For those unfamiliar, the College Board at one point started releasing SAT scores along with an index score of how much adversity a student had to overcome in their life to get to that point of taking the SAT. And there was just a huge backlash. It was not publicly well received. So I think we were while we agree with this principle, with this idea, it would have been helpful for us to see more specifics around what that could look like in a way that is promising. Next slide. Okay, perfect. So now transitioning from our specific response to the focal article, we laid out what we thought could be provocative, interesting research questions that are forward-facing and could potentially present an agenda that would lead to the answers that we want to think about these hard topics. So because of our different perspectives, we ended up each taking one. So Emma has more of a data science background. So one of these questions was more related to algorithms and how you can make tests, how to balance test scores, if that's even what you want to do. It was more like that. So that's just how we ended up with 4 different questions. We each took one that was more in line with our interests. I know there's a lot of text on here, so I'll just read out one sub research question for each main topic. The first main topic was, does the determination of test validity increase inequality? And this paragraph was all about how when we talk about validity of college admissions tests, a lot of times people point to, well, it predicts freshman year GPA. But you can also, it's not that hard to take the next step and think, well, what else is there besides freshman year GPA? Because that's probably not all that we care about for a test that is so meaningful on people's lives. In addition, there's been some research by folks out at UC Berkeley, I think, that SES is similarly predictive of first year GPA. So it might be helpful for testing companies to show you know, like an existence proof that these tests provide explanatory power above and beyond demographic groups, or like to what extent do they provide explanatory power? Sorry, I know I said I would only read one question, but I really like that topic. The second big question was, how does admissions testing affect college going students? So this speaks to the idea that, oh, there are students out there who are actually really strong performers, but because of their life circumstances, they lack the access to take the SAT and the access to basically go through the college admissions process. So there is some very thin research, thin as in like only a few studies, not that the research is bad, about this matching idea. Like if students are just out there in the world and they need to take these tests because then that shows them that they can actually go to college. Like there are studies like that. And we were thinking that more research in that vein could be useful if you're a testing company trying to argue that tests are actually providing a social benefit, right? The third big research topic was, how fair is college admissions without tests? I think we might have all watched that Netflix documentary on college admissions and cheating scandals. Basically, it makes this question, how fair are all the aspects of a college application? Is a test actually the least gameable part? So those are questions that could be researched that could provide proof or evidence of tests being like more socially equitable than other aspects. For example, like if you have a letters of recommendation that you would pay someone to write them for you, or things like that. And the last one is, how do testing agencies create new products when using biased historical data? So a lot of times testing companies are innovating and creating new products. But if you're testing those products on a sample of data that is historically collected, naturally that data will have patterns that are historically biased, right? So what are ways that companies could, first of all, understand what this influence looks like, and also what are ways that companies could mitigate this reinforcing cycle from continuing? So that's a quick summary of all the things that basically we just asked a bunch of questions and we were like, look, we are not experts, but as eager, excited graduate students who want to work in an applied measurement field that does good for society, these are things that I think we need to know, that we think more needs to be known about. There we go, I can talk. Unfortunately, we actually didn't get a big response to this section, which was disappointing, from the original authors. So now I'm moving from our commentary to the response of the original authors to the 14 or so commentaries, one of which was ours. They did bring up two ideas that are like kind of similar to what we've been saying, but we didn't get any direct engagement on our like hypothetical research agenda. Next slide. In fact, these were the 4 times that our piece was mentioned in their commentary, and to be fair, they had a lot of ground to cover. So on the right-hand side of this table are the specific quotes that mention our work, and on the left-hand side is like the takeaway point, so we can just read through the left-hand side. The first was that the first response from the original authors was that we denigrated the analogy, but it's not going to be perfect. And I think, like I kind of alluded to before, our response to that, or the way I understand that, is, well, if you can't find a corporation that has done this well, then that's kind of telling, regardless of how analogies work. The second was that we misunderstood how corporate social responsibility works. I think there might have been a miscommunication here, because the first piece talked about corporate social responsibility. And I think, at least for some of us, maybe just myself, the issue with that term is the word corporate, and expecting a company to engage in behaviors that do not actually benefit itself. However, in the response to all the commentaries, the word corporate was actually dropped and only used once. So obviously we agree that social responsibility is an important thing, but maybe we just didn't understand fully how the corporation aspect gets linked in with that. Third and related, the authors were pointing out that there's long-term goals of corporate social responsibility that we didn't fully grasp, which I think is probably fair because we are not business economics students, so we actually don't know a lot about corporate social responsibility, but in the way that it was defined in the focal piece, it seemed, and given in the Nike analogy, it seemed to not have long-term standing power. Finally, this, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, so this might have just been a misunderstanding as well, where the original authors thought that we were saying that testing companies do make predictive tests and are responsible to their clients, where I think that we would say that they are trying to develop predictive tests and they are trying to be responsible to clients. So both things in that bullet number 4, I mean, and across 1 through 4, speak to important, meaningful discussion, and we're glad that the authors raised these points. However, I think we're just a little disappointed that our substantive, like forward-facing pieces did not get engaged with. And yeah, I don't know if Emma or Tara have other things to say about the response.
I think you did a beautiful job of summarizing that, Lily. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, to be fair, they were responding to 14 different groups of people. So we're not taking this as everything that the authors believe about our piece. And I'm sure that in the NCME panel, that Emma's chairing, there's going to be more really thought-provoking discussion. So yeah, so that's all that we had in terms of content. We also listed, we wanted to open it up if there are any questions. Folks should feel free to either raise hands or come off mute, whatever you're more comfortable with. And otherwise, we also listed some guiding questions here to get the discussion going. But we really appreciate your time and your interest in our piece, because it was really fun to write with a bunch of grad students.
This is great. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we have some time now to have Q&A. So you already proposed some questions, but I think we can see what the people in the room would like to ask. So if you want to ask something, just unmute yourself if you can. I think you can unmute yourself and do the question, and please don't take more than 1-2 minutes. So anybody want to ask?
Yeah, I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed your commentary, and I found myself agreeing with most of, or all actually, the questions that you asked. But I was wondering have you ever, or did you consider thinking about the legal aspect of it and how testing companies usually try to protect themselves of legal cases? Trying to challenge the fairness of tests that they create and how that plays a role in this conversation.
I think that's a fantastic question. I personally have not learned about legal cases against testing companies. If other folks have context on that, I'd love to hear it. But one thing I do find interesting, and is that legal cases are brought against universities for the use of test scores, essentially. So, for example, Harvard has been sued a number of years ago regarding undergraduate admissions by a group for fair admissions. I forgot the name of the collective, and the case is going to go before the US Supreme Court, I think, in this coming season, to do with biased college admissions, right? So for Harvard undergrads, people are applying, and the accusation is that there are racial disparities in admissions, specifically that Asian American applicants are being discriminated against in my most recent reading of the case, which it might have developed in the last couple of years. And I think in those sorts of cases, and those sorts of cases do get brought in various, against various universities at different times, often use test scores as the ground truth of a candidate's worthiness of admission, and then use other aspects of the admissions packet, rate those in terms of their fairness compared to the ground truth of the standardized test score, right? So there was a bunch of subpoenas and data that was pulled showing, if I recall correctly, that when, like as part of the interview for undergrads, you're typically interviewed by some sort of a local Harvard alumni who's volunteering to interview. I think most students who apply get interviewed, and the interviewer then rates the candidate on a little Likert scale on a number of different aspects of how they came across in the interview. That all goes back to the admissions office and is used as part of the holistic process of admissions. I think one of the arguments made by the plaintiffs was that Asian American applicants were systematically under scored on things like their personal qualities or like their leadership, or if you were like whatever the questions were, in a way that like is racist. And I think that argument hinged on a link back to test scores as being the objective measure of the candidate's worthiness of admissions, right? And so at least in that regards, and Sarah, I know this isn't where you directed your question about kind of the legal side, because tests and numbers and quantitative things are so easy for people to see as being objective, other things being viewed in light of the truth of test scores is probably backwards compared to viewing test scores in the light of other things, which I think is really fascinating. And I'd love to see more research into it, right? We have a paragraph where we reference some research saying perhaps test scores are very predictive of, you know, your freshman year grades, but what else is predictive of those grades is things like, did you have to work a part-time job on campus or not? And that is going to be predictive of grades, as is whether the professor discriminated against you, all of these other things that go into grades. Like, are those freshman year grades in themselves some sort of objective measure of someone's like worthiness? It's difficult to figure out if there's anywhere that you could say, like, here is a ground truth that is unbiased and is definitely the thing we want to measure. So those are some brief thoughts. If anyone else wants to chime in on this, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I guess in slightly different direction than Emma's response, I would say, well, I don't think that we explicitly address the legal aspect, but that kind of ties into how we understand a corporation to behave and protecting the institution. So I guess like when we wrote from that perspective, we were kind of thinking that too, but we didn't actually like directly address it. And like Emma said, if you have more specific references about like how testing companies have been involved with legal considerations, we would definitely be interested in following up. And thanks for the question too.
Any other question or follow-up?
Sorry, I was muted. I was just saying thank you for your answers. I just think the legal aspect of it really adds a lot of complexity. And there are so many cases where testing agencies had to defend themselves. And there's this process of, it's called shifting the burden of proof between the defendant and the plaintiff, where in the end, if you can't find an alternative test that provides the same results or with good validity and reliability evidence, that's how the testing agency can protect itself. And that's why they don't want to show or share a lot of their information or the items, because of this like long-standing issues, in terms of challenging the fairness of tests. I just think it's an important thing to consider in these conversations, which I didn't see even in the original article. It's just something, like you mentioned, Emma, that I think people should engage in and research. We need to see more research in that area. But thank you.
I think one person raised her hand, Jane.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a graduate student myself. I'm doing my PhD in the UK, and my research focus is also college admissions tests. So I was very excited to hear all about your commentary and read your article as well. Well done. I'm just thinking, because my understanding is the original article is quite US centric. I suppose it makes sense because it's NCME, and so the admissions tests they mentioned, they're designed by private companies, non-profits like, I don't know, College Board or ETS or something. So I'm just wondering what you think about social responsibility for governmental or non-governmental organizations, because I think in East Asia, at least, the college admissions tests, they're published by these quite government associated organizations. And I think one thing I'm looking at in my own research is whether they should be quite transparent in their publication of data and in their social responsibility as well. But I'm not sure if it's the same thing, like corporate social responsibility and government associated responsibility. I'm just wondering what you think about it.
That's such an interesting question, Jane. Because actually, I think one of the authors is from two of the authors are from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and they mention riots in 2020 against the National University admission test. So it seemed, and then also in the response to the commentaries, they mentioned that a bunch of researchers have problems getting data from the National Testing Agency. So it's interesting that they've at least the authors have recognized similar kind of holds up and lacks of transparency for governmental as well as corporate institutions. But I don't know. I don't think I have a strong view right now. And also, maybe let me just quickly Google to see that is a national organization, government run.
Yeah, I think going back to the idea of corporate social responsibility, as it was discussed with the Nike analogy, a lot of the issues that prevent corporations from being transparent in theory, wouldn't necessarily apply to the public sector. If there are no other competitors who are creating these tests, then in theory there should be less blowback for proposing to release example items and be more transparent about what's going on, because they're not releasing trade secrets, and they don't need to invest, I guess, as heavily in their public image like a company would that is trying to make money. So I'm not sure if that framework aspects of it, I think definitely do apply, but I don't know if fully would be applicable to a government agency that's creating these assessments.
Thank you very much. It gives me something to think about in my own research.
Somebody else have some follow-up? I have one question too, but yeah, we can I can see if somebody else wants to add something. Sorry, and I copy in the chat. I am from Chile, and I remember very clearly the riots that happened against the college admission test. And actually, I shared in the chat some tweets. I'm not sure if all the links are working, but there are some videos of what happened, and how exactly was the reaction of people at that moment. All this situation happened in a very special context, because months before the riots, there were some riots nationally, and it was like a huge social uprise, and people were sensitive. And actually, it was interesting to see how many complaints about how the whole economic system was working in Chile kind of transferred to some rejection to the idea of even having a standardized test for college admission, which is very interesting. That the connection is not that clear, but definitely people felt very upset by many of the aspects of the test, to the point to literally take the chairs of some school and start to throw them, or I don't know, take materials of the test and burn them. I mean, they are even pictures. So it was very aggressive, and I think part of the context also of that paper, that maybe I don't think it was completely explained, the how do you say that, the animate, no, I'm sorry, my English is failing here. Sorry, yeah, the rejection of people to the test. Yeah, sorry. So any other question?
Yeah, thank you for that question and for the context here. I'm thinking now also about in both the Chilean context and the US context, there's clearly something that people are angry about and reacting to. And I think in both cases and in other international cases, people being frustrated with standardized tests is clearly some sort of a signal that there's something wrong, whether it is something statistical that's wrong, or whether it's something just more trust related that's wrong. I think the four kind of research areas we lay out are somewhat to do with, generally are these things predictive? Are they equally predictive for different protected subclasses? What about these gaps? But there's also, I think, a lot of other validity evidence that testing companies perhaps maybe used to take for granted. Perhaps back in the day, you say, we'll do a test, and people say, great, that sounds fair. Because it's maybe compared to a background where it's just who your father knows, doing a test seems more egalitarian than that. But if you're in today's context, I think the standard is higher to prove value, to prove that tests deserve some place in the system. And I think some of that argument needs to be made from broader things, showing that there's some signal in test scores over and above what SES promises, showing that test scores seem to reflect things that we care about, and making sure that the things we care about are measured somehow well or fairly as best as we can, reflecting maybe what opportunity people had in their high school preparation, or maybe trying to disentangle college success from simply from grades, and just thinking through exactly what we want tests to do in this process, right? And we have a couple of the research areas we've talked about here. If testing companies wish to, at least at the very bottom layers of corporate social responsibility, if they wish to get some sort of public trust back on board for a competitive edge, or to protect their business, or whatever it is, we think that there are a number of different things that they could try to do to provide research that makes a case for why tests should still be trusted or matter for anything, because perhaps that's not as taken for granted as it historically was. And that is probably a really good thing to question, are tests, is using tests better than not using tests at all? How does it compare to other methods of doing admissions that are not based on a standardized test? And that international perspective of how different countries approach this. Some are very, very standardized tests heavy, and that's the sole reason for admission. some don't use any standardized tests. I'm from New Zealand, where it's about high school grades essentially, and a few other things, but there's certainly no standardized testing involved. Looking at different ways of doing admissions, I think, is another important piece of the puzzle for testing companies to make some claim that including tests makes things better somehow.
Sorry, so I wanted to do one last question, because I remember when I read your commentary, yeah, I kind of shared I felt also uneasy when I see the comparison with the social corporate responsibility framework. However, I think after all the commentaries, it was more clear that maybe the movement from corporate to non-profit, maybe that was missing there, and that was kind of assumed, and many people struggle with that, and I can see why. And actually, it's interesting because it's like a curious aspect of the industry in terms of the business of standardized test, that it is done by many institutions that are not supposed to be for profit, but definitely there is a lot of money, at least. I'm not sure if profit is the right word, but definitely, I mean, it's a big industry. I'm not sure about the number, but I think at least in the US, it's a big industry. In Chile, at least, all the business, if you want, is done by universities, and either by the government asking some university to do something, or some university building, taking the test, or whatever. And for me, it was kind of acceptable to use the term corporate social responsibility, but I can see that eventually that triggers something else. And yeah, that I can see that was a problem. Sorry. So, and the final question is, okay, you made very great proposals and questions about how to move forward, but why do you think that hasn't happened yet? Because I think the point of the paper was more about, yeah, I mean, we know many things we can do, but people still are not doing that. So my understanding of the paper is more about like, yeah, why this is not happening, and trying to target more the attitudinal place, you know, like why the institution that could be doing something are not doing something. They are kind of proposing that if you go through this mindset of the social responsibility, then eventually they can motivate more people. So, okay, if you are not that completely on board on the analogy of social responsibility, so then why do you think testing agencies are not doing enough on this?
I think that's a great question. It makes me think of what Emma had just said about how, like, in this day and age, we kind of expect a different burden of proof, to use a legal phrase, from testing companies that previously didn't exist. And so I guess I would interpret the lack of this research having been done to date and made public as a response to a lack of demand from users. Just because of how I understand corporations to work, which again ties back to our point that this isn't a one-way street. Like, there's a relationship between universities or other users of college test scores that place a demand on testing companies. If no one's asking for it, I wouldn't expect that research to be done internally. But curious to hear what others think.
I mean, one massive spur for research, I think, in terms of not corporate social responsibility, but cynical corporate bottom line economic thinking, is a global pandemic just happened. And for health reasons, a lot of testing centers closed down. And in response to that, a number of universities made standardized tests optional as part of their admissions. And since then, many testing centers have opened back up, and many of those same colleges and universities are now saying that their test optional policies are going to continue for reasons of equity in response to both a public and just general perception that tests are undesirable, and perhaps universities are doing this for reasons of equity. Perhaps universities are doing this for reasons of publicity, or trying to get a competitive advantage in attracting more students, whatever it is. Perhaps the pressure is back on the testing companies now for affecting the bottom line to make the case. Like Lily was saying, perhaps before there wasn't the demand. And there are so many different moving parts and different actors in this space, right? Of like the public and students who are applying, universities who are test users, and who are probably very much affected by like industry norms and the status quo, and perhaps less incentivized to act as a single university going to go fix admissions somehow. But due to a series of current events on this test optional movement, I think that pressure will actually return to testing companies to do some of this research. And I'm really interested to see how that plays out, and also interested, we're starting to see that the first few really good projects come through looking at what happened when tests went away. What were the impacts of colleges going test optional? How did that affect equity? What did that do to admissions? And that literature, I think, will also be really interesting. And it's just come about due to a number of different factors like pandemic and like this sort of social movement as well. So I'm hoping to see more movement on the research front in the next little while. I think it'll be really exciting.
Yeah, sorry about the users. Well, I mean, University of California, they literally started a whole process to see if they wanted to use standard tests, and they ended up not using. And so I guess from an institutional user, I think there has been some demand. And from the student themselves, I think also there has been like a historical demand, but maybe it has not been completely structured, if you want. Sometimes it can be like sparse movements that like they raise some concerns, but it's not like something that maybe this company would understand that they should acknowledge. But I don't know, I think the user has been asking for this. So I mean, and I don't know, in my opinion, at least the whole point of the paper was kind of calling the test agencies to make them realize that there is some ethical concerns about how much they can do, but also it's part of the business. I mean, as they say in this scale of understanding, testing agencies and standardized tests are extremely political and extremely social and extremely sensitive to the information that you have or the lack of information you have about consequences and equity and many things. So yes, I mean, and right now, as you said, Emma, like the shift to optional testing is going to force, if you want. And actually, the fact that one institutional client was more even explicit about this also is creating like a shift there. All right, sorry for taking extra time. Thank you very much for presenting today. We appreciate that. The response that you wrote, it was very interesting, and the time now with us to explain more about your paper and this topic in general, I think is very, very important and interesting too.
Thank you for hosting us.
All right, and I think you share a link with the slides, right? Yeah, okay, yes. All righty, thank you very much. Bye-bye.